The people of Wyoming's Wind River Basin still spoke about the winter of 1884 many years later, not because of the storm that nearly erased entire ranches from the map, but because one widow somehow saw it coming long before the first snow ever touched the ground. When Eleanor Hart pushed the first sunflower seed into the soil only inches away from the wall of her cabin, most believed grief had finally stolen her senses. She was not planting a garden beside her home. She was building something around it. Day after day, beneath the wide western sky, she continued placing seeds in a narrow line until every side of the cabin stood surrounded by freshly turned earth. Her 10-year-old daughter Sarah followed closely behind, carrying a cloth sack of seeds, while an old brown shepherd dog named Ranger rested nearby beneath the shade of a cottonwood tree, watching the strange work as if he understood its purpose. At first the neighbors smiled and kept riding. A week later they began talking. On the frontier, every hour mattered. Fences needed repairs, wood needed splitting, livestock needed tending, and food stores needed preparing for the long winter months ahead. Nobody spent valuable spring days planting flowers against cabin walls. By early June, the whispers had spread from ranch to ranch, and before long people had given Eleanor a name she never asked for. They called her the Sunflower Widow. Jacob Miller, a sheep rancher whose property bordered the Eastern Creek, finally rode over one afternoon and watched her press another seed into the soil beside the foundation logs. "What are the flowers for?" he asked. Eleanor looked toward the cabin before answering quietly. "They're for the house." That was all she said. No explanation followed. No reason was offered. The answer only deepened the mystery. At the trading post, men joked about the strange widow wasting precious growing weather. Others claimed loneliness had clouded her judgment after losing her husband Samuel during the terrible mountain blizzard 3 years earlier. Yet Eleanor never defended herself. She never argued, and she never tried to convince anyone she was right. She simply continued planting. Inside the small cabin, the memory of Samuel Hart still remained everywhere. His coat still hung beside the door where he had left it before riding into the storm that took him. His favorite pipe rested untouched upon the mantel above the stove. Some evenings Ranger curled beside Samuel's empty chair, as though waiting for familiar footsteps that would never return. One night Sarah stood near the window, watching the young green shoots rise from the earth outside. "Would Father have liked the flowers?" she asked softly. Eleanor looked toward the darkness gathering beyond the basin and for several seconds said nothing at all. The wind whispered against the logs while somewhere in the distance coyotes called beneath the fading light. The answer never came. Years earlier, Samuel's mother had shared stories from an old German settlement further south where families used sunflowers for more than seeds and decoration. Dried stalks protected root cellars, smokehouses, and animal shelters from brutal winters that swept across the plains. The old woman used to say something Samuel never forgot. "The cold always hunts the walls first. Give it something else to find before it reaches your home." At the time, the words sounded like little more than frontier folklore passed between generations beside kitchen fires. Now, standing beside her own cabin with winter never truly far away, Eleanor finally understood their meaning. Summer slowly covered the basin in green while the sunflowers climbed higher every week until wagon travelers slowed their horses simply to stare at the unusual ring growing around the Hart homestead. Then, one August afternoon, the mountains released one of their sudden western storms. Wind rolled across the valley with enough force to flatten fences and tear loose roofing boards from nearby sheds. When the storm finally passed, nearly a third of the western row of sunflowers lay broken across the ground. Jacob Miller happened to ride past that evening and shook his head as he looked over the damage. Most people assumed the strange project had finally reached its end. The following morning they discovered Eleanor already outside before sunrise. One by one she lifted damaged stalks back into place, replacing those beyond saving and tying the survivors together with fresh cord and support stakes driven deep into the soil. Sarah carried supplies while Ranger chased wandering sheep away from the fragile plants. By the end of the week, the row stood once again and in some places looked stronger than before. The storm had tested the widow's plan, and instead of abandoning it, she had improved it. As summer slowly drifted toward autumn, More and more people found themselves wondering the same uncomfortable question. What if the Sunflower Widow knew something they didn't? To discover the answer, stay with Beyond the Fear and subscribe for the next chapter of this unforgettable Western story. By September, the sunflowers surrounding Eleanor Hart's cabin had grown taller than Sarah herself and could be seen from nearly every wagon trail crossing the Wind River Basin. Their bright faces followed the sun through the day, while travelers slowed their horses to stare at the strange wall of yellow rising from the prairie grass. Yet while most people saw beauty, Eleanor saw building material. One cold morning she began harvesting the flowers, not for decoration and not for food, but for the cabin itself. Thick stalks were cut and stacked beside the walls, while seed heads were carefully dried beneath canvas sheets stretched behind the house. Sarah worked beside her mother from sunrise until dusk, carrying armfuls of stalks almost as large as herself, while Ranger followed close behind, occasionally dropping at their feet to rest before jumping up to continue his silent patrol around the property. The first layer went up against the northern wall where winter winds struck hardest. Bundles of dried sunflower stalks were tied together with rope and pressed firmly against the cabin logs, leaving just enough space to trap pockets of still air between the layers. Day after day, the strange shell continued growing until the original wall slowly began disappearing beneath dried stems, leaves, and seed heads woven together by hand. The neighbors laughed harder than ever. Walter Boone, a carpenter who had spent 20 years building homes throughout Wyoming and Colorado, finally rode over to inspect the work himself. He circled the structure once before stopping near the doorway. "You're making a mistake," he said. Eleanor continued tying another section into place without looking up. Walter pointed toward the wall. "Moisture will gather behind those plants and rot your logs. Then the mice will move in and make the place their own before the first snow arrives." The warning sounded reasonable because it was reasonable. Every family on the frontier had fought damp wood or rodents at some point, and Walter spoke from experience rather than pride. For the first time, Eleanor stopped working and looked at the wall she had spent months growing. The wind moved gently through the dried stalks while Ranger barked somewhere near the creek. Walter waited for an answer, but none came. Eleanor simply returned to work and continued fastening the next bundle into place. By the time the carpenter rode away, he was more convinced than ever that winter itself would eventually prove him right. October arrived with frost silvering the grass each morning, and ice lingering in the shadows long after sunrise. The sunflower wall continued growing thicker until much of the cabin had disappeared beneath what looked from a distance like an enormous haystack built around a chimney. Then one morning, Sarah noticed movement near the western foundation. Mice had found shelter within the lower layers exactly as Walter predicted. The discovery could have ended everything. Instead, Eleanor carefully pulled apart entire sections of finished work, exposing the nests and removing the damaged material. Hours of labor vanished in a single afternoon. The following day she returned carrying bundles of dried sage and sweetgrass gathered from nearby hillsides. The fragrant plants were packed deep into the vulnerable spaces where rodents preferred to travel. Within days, the signs of nesting faded, and before the first snowfall, they disappeared completely. Once again, the problem had not destroyed the plan. It had improved it. During the final weeks of October, another unusual object appeared inside the Hart cabin. A thermometer hung beside the stove, and beneath it rested a worn leather ledger. Every morning and every evening, Eleanor recorded the temperature, the amount of firewood burned, and how often the stove needed attention during the night. Most people simply endured winter. Eleanor intended to study it. Harold Finch, the valley's largest supplier of winter credit, happened to notice the ledger while discussing provisions one afternoon. "You can write numbers forever," he laughed. "That won't change the weather." Several men nearby joined the laughter. Eleanor recorded another figure in the ledger anyway. Outside the cabin, the valley itself seemed to be growing quieter. Elk moved toward lower ground weeks earlier than usual, while geese vanished from the sky before November had even arrived. Old Jeremiah Voss, whose weather predictions had guided ranchers for decades, spent more time staring toward the northern mountains than speaking to anyone around him. One afternoon, he rode slowly to the Hart property and walked around the strange sunflower wall without saying a word. His eyes studied the bindings, the thickness and the careful spaces left between the layers. Finally, he stopped near the doorway and looked at Eleanor. "Who taught you this?" he asked quietly. Eleanor glanced toward the weathered stalks covering her home. "My husband's mother." Jeremiah nodded once and looked toward the distant mountains hidden beneath gathering clouds. He offered no smile and no criticism. When he climbed back into the saddle, his expression carried something far heavier than amusement. For the first time since the project began, someone who truly understood Wyoming winters had examined the wall carefully and had not laughed. Somewhere beyond the mountains, winter was already moving south, and the final test was drawing closer with every passing day. The first days of December arrived with a silence that unsettled even the oldest ranchers in the Wind River Basin. The air felt heavier, the mornings colder, and the mountains to the north remained hidden behind a curtain of gray that refused to lift. Jeremiah Voss stopped visiting neighbors and spent his evenings studying the horizon instead. The elk had already moved into lower country, the last geese were gone, and even the horses seemed restless in their pens after sunset. Around the Hart homestead, another change had appeared as well. Ranger no longer slept beneath the porch roof. Every night the old dog scratched at the door and settled, inside beside the entrance, occasionally lifting his head toward the northern wall, as if listening for footsteps carried by the wind. Then, on the morning of December 9th, the waiting finally ended. The temperature collapsed with terrifying speed, and by noon the basin had grown colder than anyone expected, possible for so early in the season. Ranch hands hurried livestock toward shelter while wagons disappeared from the roads one by one. Doors were barred, shutters secured, and stoves fed with fresh wood. By late afternoon, the wind arrived. It struck the valley with a violence that turned falling snow into white rivers racing sideways across the plains. Within an hour, fences vanished beneath drifting snow and barns disappeared behind curtains of ice and powder. The roar outside grew so loud that conversations inside homes became impossible. Entire buildings groaned beneath the pressure, while some ranchers later swore they heard timber snapping somewhere beyond the darkness. Inside the Hart cabin, Eleanor sat beside the stove while Sarah slept beneath heavy blankets, and Ranger rested near the doorway, with his ears raised toward the storm outside. Hours passed, and still the blizzard continued growing stronger. Yet something strange happened inside the cabin. The stove required less wood than usual. The walls remained warmer to the touch than they had during previous winters, and for the first time since Samuel's death, Sarah slept peacefully without waking from the cold during the night. Outside, the storm hammered against the sunflower wall again and again, but the trapped layers of air hidden within the stalks robbed the wind of its strength before it could reach the cabin logs beneath. The second wall was doing exactly what it had been built to do. By morning, several ranch buildings across the basin had suffered damage. One shed lost its roof, while another family spent the night fighting snow that forced its way through gaps in their walls. Jacob Miller rode out as soon as conditions allowed and stopped his horse in disbelief when he reached the Hart property. Snow had piled high against the outer sunflower shell while the cabin itself remained protected beneath. The chimney still smoked quietly into the frozen air. One by one, others arrived as word spread through the valley. Walter Boone walked around the structure slowly, running his hand over the frozen stalks without saying a word. Harold Finch stared at the walls that he had once called the biggest haystack in Wyoming. Even Jeremiah Voss allowed himself the smallest smile as he looked toward the northern horizon, where the storm was finally losing its grip on the land. "It worked?" Jacob whispered. Eleanor looked toward the snow-covered fields, stretching beyond the cabin. "It survived," she answered softly. Over the weeks that followed, several families began experimenting with their own versions of wind barriers and insulated walls using whatever materials the frontier offered. Some used reeds while others used brush or dried grasses, but all of them remembered where the idea had begun. The name Sunflower Widow remained, though the laughter attached to it disappeared forever. Years later, travelers crossing the basin still heard stories about the woman who wrapped her cabin in summer and used it to defeat winter itself. As for Sarah, she never forgot the lesson her mother had taught her without ever speaking the words aloud. Sometimes the ideas that save us are the very ones the world laughs at first. And sometimes survival belongs not to the strongest or the richest, but to the people willing to trust wisdom that others fail to see. If you enjoyed this journey through the old American frontier, subscribe to Beyond the Fear and join us for more unforgettable Western stories where courage, mystery, and survival ride side by side across the wild frontier.